Howdy, all you delicious people. For Ash versus Evil Dead Season 1, this will be my third time trying to review this show. The first time around, I tried to review this show, and ultimately I just didn't like how it turned out at the end of the day. It felt too vague, or it felt just too it just didn't quite feel right to me. It kind of bugged me about how this review first turned out. So I was like, hey, let's try to come back at this again, but try to review it much more detail with characters and names and stuff like that. So ultimately I did it again, and then accidentally deleted half of the review, and I'm like, oh my god, like, really? And I couldn't undelete it. So I'm like, crap. So ultimately now I'm going at this at the third time, hoping the third time is the charm to ultimately get this review done and over with, and ultimately go into finally reviewing season 2, because I want to try to bottleneck and try to do a season, not just oh yeah, I'm just gonna review both 1 and 2 and in one video, which will make this way too long, because I think within talking about this season, it takes an hour and a half for me to, because I've done it twice now, to talk about this very first season. So, and now I have to also talk about how many times I tried to do this review as well. So now, Ash vs. Evil Dead Season 1. So, going into this reasonably, this movie ultimately does harbor back to the Evil Dead films. If you had ultimately not seen the Army of Darkness film, it doesn't really matter. It honestly doesn't really quite matter that you haven't seen Army of Darkness or not, because it makes it to where it's like, hey, if you've just seen the Evil Dead movie, then that is kind of the all that you'll need to probably know about this movie as you go into it. So, going into this, if you've probably either watched Evil Dead or Evil Dead 2, basically they're both the same movie, so it doesn't really matter. Basically it's having Bruce Campbell redo a film they've already done. And because I've reviewed both Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, the original ones, I know they did remake Evil Dead, but I don't think any of those characters are incorporated into this. It's all just the original Bruce Campbell Ash approach to this. So, going into this show, it's a lot of fun. Reasonably, you can probably at some points in time, you can kind of taste the small budget kind of going on to this film, because ultimately, at some points, there's some pretty good things going on with some demons and stuff like that. But then there's some times where it's just okay, this is the villain of this story. This is kind of the overall approach to this thing. But I do really love how this show goes into very much having closure of the Evil Dead films. It comes back around to give you Evil Dead within this show. Going into this is a story about mostly focusing, I believe, on the characters called Deadites, that ultimately are the characters that seemingly change from a normal person to then bizarrely changing into some zombie-esque looking character to go and attack said whoever is normal human-like person and trying to kill them to death. Kill them to death? Yeah. Try to murder them. Do them in. Give them the good old 1-2. So, going into this show, I thought that it was really fun. I really enjoyed the journey of this movie, or this show, I mean. This show, of course, is on Netflix, if you didn't know it even existed. or mainly you're kind of curious about the Evil Dead series, really I would say go and check these things out because it's really fun. It really is. It's it's horror, but it's horror, but it's fun. It's funny. It's comedic deliveries and reasonably. Um, if you haven't seen it, I think you have to because it's just a really fun thromp that ultimately you'll just really enjoy, and it won't be one of those where you're like consistently jumping and or scared. You're just like, man, I'm really having a really good time. To be brutally honest, it's how these Evil Dead things kind of approach itself. Like I think the very first like Evil Dead takes itself a little bit seriously. Evil Dead 2 tries to get into a little bit more like it does a little bit more funnier things. And then Army of Darkness is just kind of a really time period piece of medieval timed like fun, which like is its own thing, or ultimately is like otherwise kind of barely tied into Evil Dead 2. But it's just kind of a fun little thromp, and at the end of the day, that's probably all I want to say about this movie in a very cryptic, or all I want to say about this show. I always get movies and shows confused. It's a very fun show that at the end of the day you'll say like, hey, if I wasn't intrigued about Evil Dead, I think now I will be. Or ultimately if you're kind of coming back into this or however you want to do it. Because I think after because I had to watch the first two Evil Deads, and I was like, because I had them somewhere. I'm like, I need to finally sit down and watch these now. And then I did. I'm like, man, these movies are really fun. And then so all of a sudden I was like, well, you know what? I also have like I have so much crap lying around that I never got to. And then once I do get to it, I'm like, yeah, I've I've been waiting to watch this movie or show for a long time, and now I sat down and finally got to see it because I had time, and it was so worthwhile watching. So that's what I would probably say about this show. It's a worthwhile watching. And at the end of the day, it has some raunchy comedy into it. It has some adult content situations. It has some gore in it. So ultimately, be prepared for, dare say, a lot of number of things going on in this show that ultimately could go any number of ways. So let's go into spoilers about this show because if anything, it'll take a lot longer to mention everything that goes on into this show than it will be to talk about this cryptically. So at the end of the day, go out of your way to watch this show. It's easily on Netflix. You can check it out. I think there's only like 10 episodes. So reasonably, if you've never seen an Evil Dead thing in your life, check this out. Because more than likely, it kind of dips in to tell you the previous story of the Evil Dead movies. So if you don't know about the Evil Dead movies, basically that is also on Netflix, tying in with the show. But if you don't know, it'll give you a little intro of that a little bit to tell you what happened during the Evil Dead movies. And there are certain times where they will add little clips here and there of the movie, which for some people that had seen it, like, oh yeah, I remember that scene. And sometimes at some points, like some of the scenes, I'm like, okay, this doesn't actually make sense for why they added it into the show. But I guess it's just a like, hey, if we don't have anything here, let's just add this in here to just kind of add an interesting little look back at something. So let's go into the spoilers of this season. Ultimately, I'm going to try as much as possible to give you character names, but if I mispronounce something or if I don't get details of this season quite right, I do apologize. But reasonably, when going into this, there's some stuff that is more important than other things. So, let's go into the spoilers about first season of Ash vs. Evil Dead. So let's go into that double five. Let's bust out the countdown. And ultimately, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil the show. So, reasonably within this show, I just want everyone to know that this show isn't 100% tied to Ash 24/7. Even there are supporting characters that have to help out this story because Ash doesn't really have uh, anything of momentum going on to help you, like, hey, we're retying Ash's background into this entire show. No, it's a lot of supporting characters helping Ash through this story. So now, spoilers. So, in the very beginning of episode 1, we have a focal pointed thing going on with uh with this detective. I think her name is Amanda. And so she is going in on a house call with her partner. And so ultimately she is going in to talk to this woman, but we find out that this woman is a deadite. And so ultimately, this deadite grabs her partner and tosses him onto this mounted reindeer head, and ultimately, or deer head, and he ultimately uh, gets antlers into his chest and dies. So ultimately, of course, as per usual, this woman is lighting this deadite girl up with bullets, and of course, it's not really working. And so eventually, she has to come up with some way to try to kill this woman, and she does. But eventually, she has to, like, basically, like, her partner comes back, has to take care of him as well. And so, reasonably, after killing 2 people via this house call, she is left destitute to otherwise be, like, told, like, hey, after you, like you can come back onto the force after you pass this, like, psych eval and all these other tests that we're going to give you. So she's destitute to just be, like, left to, like, just, like, go, okay, well, I have nothing to do now because the force doesn't want me to work on any case. So what am I going to do? So all the while, we find out why that deadites are all of a sudden coming back, because Ash had taken a woman into his trailer, and ultimately he's with her, just kind of drinking, boozing, weeding it up, stoning his way to oblivion. And so ultimately, this girl is just like, you know what, like, I am going to start speaking, like, French, and I'm going to start, like, ultimately saying, you know what, I would love to just hear some poetry right now. I would just love to just, like, hear sonnets and this and that. And so Ash is just like, well, hey, like, I maybe got some poetry for you. Hey, maybe hear this. And so Ash, stupidly, opens up the Necronomicon, the Book of the Dead, and starts reading out of it because it's the only book that he has, and so it's the only book that might sound intriguing to her. And so him doing that reopens up this book to be unsheathed and has the dead walk again. So Ash is fortunate to have a. We find out that Ash is in a bathroom with some woman having some bedroom business together. Into this bathroom, he is just thrusting away with this woman in the bathroom because that is his thing. Ultimately, he likes to take a bunch of waitresses into the bathroom and have what is called a unique fingering like time. So they go in there, and so ultimately he's getting her ready, but he's also getting himself ready. And so this woman is having a good time. She's like, yeah, I'm feeling it. And then all of a sudden she turns into a deadite and looks at Ash and is telling him, it's like, we're coming for you. And then she turns right back to this waitress. And then Ash is like, whoa, yeah, you know what, maybe I'm just not like, maybe I'm just not like in the mood right now. Maybe I'm not ready. But this waitress is like, well, come on, like, if anything, like, how about you, like, do something for me then? And so ultimately he's like, well, maybe I'll just give it the old college try. And then he gets right back to it. So Ash realizes that he had reopened this book back up again. And so immediately he is uh, in destitute to say, like, you know what? I think it's my time to go on a road trip, hit the old dusty trail to try to drive away from these monsters coming at me. So he ultimately tells his neighbor, his trailer neighbor, that, hey, I'm going to be leaving here. If anything, could you do me a favor and clean up my trailer? It's a little dusty in there. If you can give it the old 1 2 1 2 and kind of really go deep in there. And his neighbor's like, anything for you, sweetie. And she goes in there and starts cleaning his trailer. Because ultimately he's telling her, yeah, I'm leaving. This is my last day. I'm going to get out of here. So ultimately, Ash goes to work. He goes to work and he tells his boss at his convenience store, he's like, well, hey, I think this is going to be my last day. Can I pick up my check? His boss is just like, well, at the end of the working day. And so he's like, oh, really? Like, come on. Like, can I just pick up my check? This is going to be my last day. So ultimately, he ends up getting bulbs, and he grabs a thing of bulbs and drops all of them, and then just starts walking on all of the bulbs. He goes into the back room, grabs a broom, and then just shoves all the bulbs underneath this wood pallet. And he's like, do 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 do, sweep, and so Pablo walks in and he's like, you know what, hey man, like, I'm going to help you out. I'll clean up this whole, like, these bulbs that you dropped, you stupid schlub. And so it's so and Pablo's so nice he wouldn't say that, but anyways, Pablo. So ultimately we have it to where Ash is telling Pablo that it's like, hey man, like, it's great that you're my friend and everything like that. So I'm going to tell you, hey, this is my last day, because ultimately uh, there is a thing that is like coming after me went um, that came after me when I went with some friends of mine to a cabin, and they had all gotten killed, but I'm the last one to survive, and so it's coming after me again. So I need to leave. And ultimately, Pablo's like, "Oh man, that's too bad to hear. Well, if anything, like, since this is your last day, it's like, well, how about we kind of have like a nightcap, or we just kind of like have like a send off for you or something. Like, and if anything, hey, maybe you should go and introduce yourself to the new girl." And because Pablo is starting to really like this new girl, and so Ash looks at the new girl and she's like smoking hot, this girl named Kelly. So ultimately he's like, well, I think I can muster up something to tell her. And so he goes over there and he tells her, it's like, well, like, I know you're going to have a tear in your eye when I tell you this, but I'm leaving. This is my last day. And ultimately, I know that this is going to break your heart, but I must be leaving here. And like Kelly is like, I don't even know who you are. It's, he's like, because Ash, for every time that him and a woman are in a room together, like immediately every time a woman like must see Ash, he immediately thinks that like her world is going to end unless she is with him. So that's his shtick. That is the funny thing about him. He's always like a woman chaser, but like he never like he chases them, but he never ever like keeps them because they either die or they otherwise are just a fling for him to have. So eventually, uh, Kelly is having to leave because she has an important phone call, and then Ash just goes into the back room um, to go and kind of do anything to just kind of finish the rest of his shift. Kelly goes and ends up getting a phone call from her father letting her know that, hey, she's back. She's back. And then ultimately we find out that ultimately what is back is actually her mother. She's here. She's here. And ultimately Kelly's like, who's here? And then it's ultimately you hear her mother in the background muttering something. And so that's how the phone kind of ends. And then Kelly's like, oh my God, I need to go because I need to find my um like I need to go back home because my mother is home. My mother who had bizarrely like gone missing, and all of a sudden she is poof appearing at my home. So Kelly is getting a ride from somebody to ultimately go to her home, and Pablo hears about this, and he eventually wants to like go and see her to maybe uh, have him be her shoulder to cry on or some kind of support. So eventually Pablo is going to find a way to get to Kelly. And so ultimately we have Ash in the back room that is ultimately repetitiously now being attacked by all kinds of demons and what have you into this back room. There's a little smallish little creature that tries to attack him, and ultimately, like repetitiously, the more and more Ash is trying to just do his normal day to day stuff, the more he's realizing he's not going to be able to. So everybody, it just gets to the point to where Ash is just like finishing his last day, and then he eventually leaves. He eventually leaves to go to his trailer, and ultimately he is very concerned that anybody is going to be coming for him to try and kill him. So reasonably, every single time like someone comes to his trailer or anything, he's just like on the edge because he's like, oh my God, like is this thing that's going to be at my door something that's going to try and kill me? And so immediately suspense is really building, and so ultimately Ash opens his door. It's Pablo just to say, hey man, like I thought we were going to have the little party, a little send-off for you or whatever. So they ultimately try to have a little like soiree and this and that. And so all while that is going on, we eventually have it to where ultimately Ash realizes that his neighbor that was cleaning his trailer is still in his trailer, and so ultimately he uh, is going through his trailer to try to get this woman. So ultimately he realizes that this neighbor of his is a deadite, and so Ash is now scrambling to fight this neighbor in this very confined trailer. And so ultimately, uh, Pablo is like so disoriented and not quite understanding what is going on. But so Ash is trying to use whatever he can to fight this woman off, to where eventually we have to have this very special moment of Ash first using his chainsaw in this show, to where ultimately we have to have the moment of Pablo throwing him the chainsaw, saying, hey, use this. He throws the chainsaw. Ash takes his prosthetic hand off to click into the chainsaw, and just, yeah, we have to have a whole like signature moment of Ash first getting this chainsaw hand. And so right after that, he goes into town and starts chainsawing away his neighbor. And so Ash and Pablo are covered in blood, and they're just like, well, I guess we took care of that. And so, like, I guess we should just, like, go on our way and just, like, go on this road trip together. And funny thing is, it doesn't matter what the story is. Every single time anyone kills anyone in this world, immediately they are showcased as a murderer. And so immediately after Ash kills his neighbor, there is a report that goes out of Ash killing this woman, and ultimately there is a sketch out there of Ash killing this woman. Because he killed somebody, it doesn't matter if it was a monster or not, it's just he killed someone. So this report had gone out on Ash, and so the detective Amanda gets a sketch of Ash, and so while she's getting a sketch of Ash out there to be like very concerned about things and everything like that, tying back Amanda, we have to where Ruby, Lucy Lawless, that a lot of people might know as Xena Warrior Princess, is in this show. I'm like, yeah, like, I kind of figured that probably one of either Sam Raimi or Bruce Campbell's friends would probably be in this show. Anybody from probably Xena Warrior Princess would probably be in this show, because a bulk of the time you would see Sam Raimi kind of use the same people, like a lot of his friends, and Bruce Campbell would tend to do that a lot as well. To where anybody tied with Xena Warrior Princess or Hercules or any of those shows would probably eventually be inserted somewhere in here to be used. So, going into this, we have Lucy Lawless, Xena Warrior Princess, as Ruby, who is this character that just comes from out of the ground as this this deadite that comes from just out of the ground. So she's like a skeleton at first, and eventually, slowly but surely, gains more and more flesh and bone and this and that to eventually become a actual real girl. So, and her power is persuasion, I believe. So Ruby goes and finds Amanda and the detective, and ultimately tells her, hey, like what are you here for? Like, what are you doing? And like what did you do as a job? And ultimately Amanda tells her that, yeah, I was a detective, and ultimately, like, I was working on a case and my partner died. And so ultimately she's like, well, like, shouldn't you go after your partner's killer? And it's like, well, yeah, I did, and I killed that person. It was like, oh. So immediately she is like kind of talking her in about her job, and ultimately telling her like kind of what she's doing. And so eventually Amanda shows her a sketch of Ash, and Ruby goes, "Oh yeah, I know this person. He had killed my entire family, and so yeah, I want to get revenge on this guy. Like, if anything, like, you know what you should be doing? You should be looking for this man. Like, if anything, like, I'm sure if me and you put two and two together, like, we can probably find him." And so, like, Amanda's like, "Yeah, you know what? How about we do that?" And so Ruby and Amanda are on their road trip, and so is Ash. So we have it to where Ash and Pablo's first stop is to go to Kelly's home because Pablo is telling Ash about how, like, hey, yeah, just so you know, like, Kelly, um, the girl that I'm seemingly infatuated with, is like going home to her mother and father, uh, or her her mom, because evidently her mom came back home from being missing for I don't know how long, and ultimately he's like, you know what, like, do you, because they're still on this road trip covered in blood, and so Pablo's like, hey, do you have like a towel that I can wipe myself down with? And so Ash gives him uh like a small tiny like wet wipe, and he's like, yeah, I can't do anything with this. And so immediately he's just like, ah, whatever. So Ash basically tells Pablo, it's like, no, like, this is not what it seems. Like, if anything, the reason why this mother is now coming home now is because she was dead and is now returning back to the grave to get to me. And Pablo's like, how? And he's like, put two and two together here. Like, you and me, like, ultimately you're her friend, ultimately knowing full well that, like, that I would come to you into this journey. Uh, and so this thing is trying to figure out a way to get to me. And so, and they're using one of my coworkers and this, that. So we have it to where Ash and Pablo make it to Kelly's home, and they're covered in blood. And basically, the mom and dad are like, "Hey, yeah, you guys are bloody." It's just okay. So they come up with some unreasonable story that they had gotten ran over by a deer, or they had run over a deer and the deer exploded. And the father is like, well, I go hunting and there's no way that a deer would just explode. It's like, well, evidently you don't know much about exploding deer. And so they are convinced, they're like, okay, sure. So ultimately they clean them up, and then they ultimately have them sit around for dinner. Well, before that, Ash and Pablo are trying to convince Kelly that her mother is dead or is a zombie, and they're trying to explain to her, like Ash tried to do to Pablo, where his journey is taking him. And Kelly wants nothing of it. She's like, no, I'm not convinced. Like, if anything, this is my mother, and she's now come back to me, and I don't care what you guys are saying. So ultimately, everybody's sitting down to get to dinner, and immediately Ash, every time the mother is eating, he is just imagining, because there is several times where Ash dips into these fantasy like modes of, he wants to see what he wants to see. And so that dips into here from time to time. So when those moments happen, I will mention them. So the entire time Ash is watching Kelly's mother eat, she is splurting out blood from out of her mouth while it seems like she's eating a normal food. And so Ash is talking to Kelly's mother and saying, "Yeah, you know what? Like, it seems like you were here to come back for Kelly, but I know what you're really here for, Mom. Like, you're here for the big fish. You're here for me. You're here for Ash." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, and Kelly's like, zip it, Ash." And he's like, "No, like if anything, you don't want a ribeye, you want a big, fat, juicy, succulent steak, and that's me." Like in some ways around that, and so, and not going through every single detail of everything that everyone says, and so eventually the husband is like, "What are you talking about?" And like the mother is like, I don't know what are you talking about either. Like, Kelly, do you understand? It's like, so Ash starts like randomly popping off with all of these questions. He ultimately is asking her everything that Kelly's mother should probably know. And so basically he starts rattling off, "Hey, like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite this? What's your favorite that? What's your favorite book?" And she ultimately mentions some like fisherman's book. And ultimately the husband's like, "I like fishing." And Ash looks at him and he's like, "Shut up, I'm not talking to you." And so Ash keeps rattling off all of these things. And so eventually the mother gets so rattled that it gets to the point to where eventually she goes and attacks the husband and starts eating her husband. And then so eventually Ash and Pablo are going to go to attack her, but instead Kelly grabs her mother and puts her into another room, and like they are trying to Pablo and Ash are like, "Dude, I told you, like I told you." So Kelly is talking to her mother, and Kelly's mother is basically saying, "I don't know what came over me. If anything, yeah, I must be really sick. Maybe if anything, if you and me put our heads together, maybe we can, um, maybe I can like get through this." And Kelly is naively like going, "Yeah, I think you're right." And so Kelly turns her back on her mother, and her mother turns into a demon. And so ultimately, uh, Kelly is fighting her off. Pablo and Ash come in there and have to kill her own mother. And so now Kelly is on a warpath because ultimately they turned her mother into a monster, and now she wants to go on this journey with Ash, with Pablo, to kill more of these things because ultimately they gave her back her mother only to take it away from her, and so she is ticked. So they are all on this journey to eventually go into having Ash try to figure out the Necronomicon. And so ultimately, Ash's next step is to ultimately get this book to someone who can read it. And so ultimately, we have Ash bring this book to some librarian that can speak the language. All the while this is going on, at some point, we find out that Amanda is talking to Ruby, and Ruby shows her this thing wrapped in a towel. She unwraps the towel, and it is actually Ash's original hand that had been chopped off. And Amanda is like, the detective is looking at it. She's like, "Oh my god, like that thing is gross and it's moving. And Ruby mentions that it's like, well, yeah, it seems like the closer that we are getting to Ash, the more that this hand is starting to come alive and move. And so this is how we can start to track him down, is figure out when this hand is moving that we're getting closer and closer to Ash. So Ruby and Amanda are getting close to being at this same bookstore, library, Ash-like location that Ash is, to get his book read to him and figure out what the answer is. And ultimately, they're going to be there to try to stop them at some point. Also, we find Ruby at points here and there that she is also killing some other demons or some other people getting like finding out about her to get information of where Ash would be, or ultimately she's just killing people to try to get some information. So ultimately, we have it to where Ash is getting somebody who can read the book. And the very first thing when Ash and Kelly and Pablo are there, Ash is asking the guy that can read the book, okay, so how do I close this book back up again, the Necronomicon? And the guy that can read the book is telling him, it seems like the book is telling me that the answer is inside of you. And Ash is like, what kind of metaphorical garbage is that? Like, if anything, that makes no sense. Like, I don't understand this at all. Like, what the, like, I don't get this. And so Kelly goes off, and eventually we find that, like, Kelly is in the same place where Detective Amanda is, and they're all at the same store. And eventually, it ends up that it gets to the point where Kelly eventually handcuffs Detective Amanda to the store to keep her from trying to either prevent Ash from doing what he's doing, or to ultimately just stop her from getting further to try to stop these people because they're trying to do the right thing. If anything, Amanda is trying to tell Kelly that she's like delusional and whatever, that like, hey, don't go with this guy. This guy is actually a murderer. And Kelly's like, no, like, he's doing the right thing and you don't know any better. So we ultimately have Pablo and Ash trying to figure out what to do next because they're like, I don't understand what this book means. And so Pablo just relents and he's like, well, hey, how about since this book can talk, or since this book can is not really quite giving us the exact answer, how about we just summon something from the book to give us this answer? And so Ash is just like, oh my god, you beautiful genius. So Ash is just telling the guy that can read the book, he's like, okay, how about you summon the weakest demon out of this book to give us the answer that we need? And so the guy is looking through the book and he's summoning a demon that honestly sounds too vague to where it's like, well, it seems like this demon on this book is like malevolent or something like that, and I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. And so like Ash is just like, well, yeah, that might sound perfect because it really sounds like this demon is some kind of bookworm. And so it gets to the point to where the demon is shot out of the book. And so what ends up happening is that the demon is not giving Ash any answers. And so Ash is just like, you know what? It seems like we're gonna get nothing out of this demon. It just seems like a waste of time. Hey, book guy, how about you like just shove this demon back into this book? And so this demon is much more powerful than Ash and the book guy think. And so immediately the demon kills the guy that can read the book and then is torturing and electrocuting the Ash and Pablo to the point to where they can't move. So Kelly gets back um, after taking care of this detective, and so eventually she just decides, because ultimately like the Pablo and Ash can't really do anything, they're just kind of stuck, and so they're like, hey, like somebody must need to like read the book and probably figure out some way to like reverse this spell. And so Kelly takes it upon herself to uh, try as much as possible to just uh, get the book read, and eventually the while reading the book, it ends up that the demon just goes into her rather than going into the book, because escape route for this demon. So they Ash and Pablo and Kelly are all like high five, and they're like, "Yeah, we beat this demon!" And so all of a sudden, bizarrely, Kelly is starting to feel a little sick. She's like, "You know what? I'm not feeling all that well." So basically, Ash and Pablo don't know much about this whole like detective, and so they're just kind of like going about their days and kind of going to a different route. And so ultimately Pablo decides, hey, you know what? I have like a family member that is a shaman, and he's like a guy that can kind of make people do uh, like inner body walkabouts, like ultimately have them like smoke peyote and have them go on like spiritual uh, kind of inner body like journeys. And so Ash is like, well, hey, maybe that'll work. And so they go to this family member that ultimately Pablo's like, yeah, I don't know about this guy, because ultimately he's just kind of like I don't know if this guy's gonna like me coming to his place or not, but like we have to go to this guy. So Pablo goes to his I think his uncle, and so Pablo goes to this uncle, and immediately at first, like his uncle is telling Pablo, like, dude, I don't like that you came here. I don't like that you like visited me. And but ultimately, while Ash is trying to like tell him what's all going on, his uncle what's all going on, and everything like that, Pablo's uncle goes and talks to him alone and says, you know what, like, man, I really like respect you, Pablo. Like, you know what, like, because you like this guy that you're with is in like the worst he's in like the worst possible crap ever, and you're fighting this with him, like, and so man, like I'm really proud of you, because you're like even going like way farther beyond than I would. And so like I'm proud of you. And so Paul was like, oh wow, that's nice. So ultimately, while Ash and Pablo's uncle are going on this uh out of body but inside of body peyote like journey, which I'll get back to. We ultimately have it to where Kelly is starting to feel a little unlike Kelly. And immediately she's consistently looking at Pablo and she's like, you know what? Like, Pablo. And so ultimately, Kelly is telling Pablo that, hey, you know, it'd be great if we would just get maybe some of your uncle's weed and like smoke some of it. And Pablo's like, you know what? Maybe that's not a bad idea, because ultimately, Kelly is offering to like please Pablo if he gets to the weed. So he's like, yeah, I'm definitely going to do that for you. And so Pablo leaves, and he comes back with Kelly smoking weed out of a shotgun barrel. And he's like, what is going on? And she's like, well, I couldn't wait. So I thought I would smoke some weed out of this shotgun barrel. And he's like, is that even safe? And she's like, well, it's not even loaded. And basically, like, Kelly's hitting on Pablo even more, and like, hey, again, if you smoke this shotgun barrel weed, like, I'm gonna do some things for you. So Pablo is very like hesitant on wanting to smoke any weed. He's like, how about I go and uh, chug a thing of Mountain Dew and maybe get a buzz off of that? And she's like, no, smoke the weed out of the shotgun barrel. And so he's grabbing the barrel and he's like, you know what, I'm not sure. And so while it seems like she's putting weed in, she's actually taking the weed out and putting the shotgun shells in to ultimately go and kill Pablo, but he doesn't know that. So ultimately, he's just like, you know what, I don't want to smoke any weed. And so she pops the shotgun and is going to shoot Pablo, but instead, her and Pablo go to find Ash and Pablo's uncle. So we have to where Ash is on his inner body out of mind journey, whatever you want to call it, and he is off on this journey because ultimately he had at first been trying to drink as much all right. So for some reason, everything is working against me to not get this review out. I don't know what it is. I don't know why it is, but it like everything is going against me trying to get this review out. So, because tablet just shut off, and plus on top of that, it was also like any recording that I had at a certain point just didn't save. So that's great. So we're going to transition back to where I could continue from where I was from previous video that was saved at some point. So what happens is that Kelly, shotgun now in hand, is going to Ash with Pablo to confront him, because that is the main goal, to try to get to Ash. Everything is led up to Ash. So Ash is on his bender, is on his out of mind body experience. So he is in his La La Land, or his happy place, his Jacksonville. He's ultimately imagining what Jacksonville is, but Jacksonville isn't what Jacksonville would actually be. It's just whatever Ash would probably think Jacksonville would be, because he never went. Jacksonville is his happy place because ultimately it was the place that he was supposed to go to when him and his girl were supposed to get out of that cabin. They were supposed to get out of that cabin to go to Jacksonville to live happily ever after. But since his girl had died, he never went to Jacksonville And so, if anything, he is forever hoping that Jacksonville would be his happy ending that he never got. So, when he's in his out of body experience, but technically much more inside of his body because he's trying to figure some things out, some peyote like trip. So he's hallucinating, and so ultimately he's imagining he's in Jacksonville, and ultimately he's talking to some lizard and asking him what sex he is because he doesn't understand um, like lizard gendership or whatever. And everything that he's trying to go through this entire body is not really giving him the answer because it's just not. It's not going to. And so eventually he wakes up to have a gun being put on Pablo by Kelly. And so now, ultimately, what ends up happening is they end up getting the gun away from Kelly, tying her up. And now they're trying to figure out what is the next step to do because Pablo's uncle is not an exorcist like a spiritual guide. He's just a guy that is just filling up people with peyote and sending them on their trips. Like he doesn't know how to exercise people. That's not his ball game. So they basically come to the like Ash is coming to the consensus to tell Pablo, hey, Kelly, I think we need to kill her, or otherwise the demon is going to do that for us. Like, basically, this demon is trying to destroy Kelly or destroy her body to give her no hope, so that way she ultimately decides to no longer exist in her body. So it's probably just going to be inevitable that we are going to have to kill her, or ultimately the demon is the only thing that's going to be left within Kelly. So either way, I think we're going to have to kill her. And Pablo is like, no, how about I ultimately save Kelly by sacrificing myself to this demon to tell this demon that he can be willing, or that I'm willing for him to possess me. And because ultimately all these demons would probably be able to always need a willing host. So I'm going to have this demon possess me, and then you guys are just going to either have to kill me or do something with me to protect Kelly. So Pablo goes to the demon and ultimately says, hey, I'm ready and willing for you to possess me. And so the demon takes his hands and crawls out of Kelly's mouth, which I'm like, okay, how exactly did they shoot that? Was it all computer effects or what? Like, how exactly did they do that? That is kind of interesting to see how that shot was done. So anyways, the entire demon comes out of Kelly's mouth and presents himself right in front of Pablo to start to get possessed. Ash moves Pablo out of the way and kills the demon. So what happens is Kelly ends up asking Pablo the entire time what exactly happened with her being possessed, because ultimately the entire time she was hitting on him, ultimately with the whole weed shotgun-like thing, that ultimately he tried not to smoke any of the weed, and so eventually that led her to just grab the shotgun with the shotgun barrels and take him to Ash. I'm saying all this just to reiterate, just because I don't remember exactly where exactly I spokenly left off, because I kind of waited to see what was the last thing that I said through the last video. So all this is going to be transferred and everything like that going on. So, but knowing full well of where I can easily transition. So ultimately, they are all going to eventually just leave Pablo's uncle to eventually just go further on into their road trip, because ultimately there was no real answers to be had, and so reasonably it was kind of like a mood point to just kind of get this demon to show up, but nothing else was really and truly viable out of this whole mission that they were trying to do. Pushing them on to another restaurant, or ultimately another diner, to where ultimately they're eaten away, and ultimately Ash is telling Kelly and Pablo that they have the bill on this one, and ultimately Pablo and Kelly are telling Ash, it's like, well, no, you said that you had the bill, like you were saying, hey, I got this one, guys, believe me, I got it, and ultimately Ash is like, well, no, like I thought you got it. And so ultimately what ends up happening is all while this hassle is going on, they're getting the check. Ultimately, Ash is noticing an old friend. He goes to talk to him. This old friend is one of his that I think he probably uh, met in some AA meeting somewhere or something like that, because this guy had been sober for a whole 9 days. And they're just kind of catching up and everything like that. And so reasonably, like, it's just a catch up moment for this person to understand who this kind of backstory is, but when then going into it, it's just to drive home a story that happens later. So Ash eventually has to pay the bill for this meal. Pablo and or Ash tells Pablo and Kelly to go on ahead into the car, and he will find out some way to figure out how to pay for this bill. The waitress comes around, and Ash tells the waitress, "Hey, I have a special gift. My hand, as you can see, is a prosthetic. But the other hand that I have is exceedingly much more like sensitive and much more like it's twice the hand or whatever. It's twice the hand. Like it's making up for the lack of limb and whatever. So ultimately, what I'm gonna do is you and me go into this bathroom stall, and we're gonna have a good time. We're gonna like I'm ultimately gonna show you how this hand is gonna make you to the point to where after I leave you out of this bathroom, you're gonna want to marry me and come with me for the rest of my days. But sorry, lady, that's not gonna happen. But we're gonna have these moments together, and it's just gonna knock your socks off and this and that. Like this Ash is just a smooth operator, smooth talker to any lady and whatever. So the waitress is just like, well, hey, that's great and all, but I think reasonably, I think uh, the chef, who is also my husband, probably wouldn't like me going into some bathroom stall with some stranger that I barely know. So Ash is just like, well, hey, like I'm gonna go to the bathroom for 2 minutes, and ultimately, if you come, you come, but we'll settle this after. You know what I mean? So he goes into the bathroom stall, and he ends up being uh having someone come into the bathroom with him, but it is a woman, but it's not the waitress. It ends up being the detective Amanda. And so they start wrestling around because ultimately she's trying to cuff him, and ultimately he is trying to convince her that he's not the killer that she thinks. And ultimately they're just wrestling, and it ends up that reasonably Ash convinces her, hey, how about we call it a truce? If anything, we are both on the same journey, the same path. Uh, to take down these monsters, and ultimately you coming with me maybe I can convince you what I'm saying is true, and then ultimately maybe you and me are gonna have a little bit more than just a tussle in the bathroom stall. And so again with Ash's fantasies, uh, the detective says, "Well, that sounds like a fine idea, and maybe also uh, you can show me what you were going to do to that waitress in the bathroom." And he's like, "Yeah, I sure would." And so then he goes out of this fantasy, and then the detective Amanda says, "Sure would what?" And he's like, "Oh, nothing. I was just daydreaming." She's like, "Sure would what?" And he's like, "No, let's go." So the detective pays the bill. They end up leaving. So it ends up that all these people go into the car. They go about their journey. They make it their way through, and then they eventually get stopped by a bunch of hillbilly like hunters that eventually were all hunting and eventually had started to find some people turning into deadites and trying to kill them. And so all these hunters had started to hunt all these deadites down, and immediately, since thinking these people present themselves within these hunter commando-ish looking guys, that otherwise they are deadites as well. Seem like every person that they're going to meet, they have to question whether they're deadites or not. And so Kelly and Pablo go with one group of hunters, and then another group of hunters shove Amanda and Ash down some like cellar esh like place, or some kind of like uh, underground like place, and like basically tell them, "Hey, there's also somebody else down here with you, and you can figure out whether that guy is one of you or one of them. But ultimately, you guys are gonna have to figure that out." And Ash is just like, "Well, that would be great if we ultimately would have our weapons down here." And he's ultimately just like, "No." At any point, I'm probably gonna forget a lot of anything that happens with Ruby within this show, because I honestly think a lot of the points, like Ruby is not a very effective enough villain for me to really care about any number of times that she uh, comes upon this show, if anything, because reasonably a lot of her stuff is just not important enough. Like, it doesn't really feel like they gave us a solid enough villain, even though knowing full well if you're a Xeno Warrior Princess fans, or ultimately if you're just knowing full well that Bruce Campbell was uh, with all these people and stuff like that, knowing Lucy Lawless is basically a really good friend of Bruce Campbell's. Like, it's great to see her here, but when looking at it, it's just like she wasn't a good enough villain to really cementingly just be like, yeah, like it's just like a face that that ultimately goes into just being like, okay, she's here, but she's not. Like, I don't really see Lucy, sadly enough, as a real like villain. She's just a person that's just there, that's persuading people. So if I forget about Ruby a lot of the scenes that she's in, I apologize. But otherwise, if I forgot to mention at one point, because I don't know if I mentioned this, because I had probably said this before Amanda got to Ash in this diner, uh, Ruby had showed Amanda a thing that is resting inside this cloth, and ultimately Ruby had opened this up, and it was a human hand. And ultimately, this hand had bizarrely started to move, and Amanda didn't understand this. Ruby explains that this hand is the hand of Ash, and every time that how she's tracking Ash down is the more that this hand starts to move even more, that they are getting closer to Ash. So that's a mood point, but it is what it is. So we go into Ash going down to this environment with Amanda, and ultimately they're meeting the guy that they met in the diner that had been sober for 9 whole days, and he'd been really proud about it. And ultimately, at first, Ash is like, "Oh, hey, it's you. Hey, buddy. Yeah, great." But then eventually, this guy turns into a deadite and tries to kill them. Eventually, they try to run away from him, but then eventually they decide, how about we face him and have him come to us, and then we have a plan of attack to kill him, and they do so. Eventually, Pablo and Kelly end up concocting a plan to eventually put on one of the disguises of one of the deceased, like gas mask-ish, like military guys, and so to eventually start killing all the rest of these people. And so eventually Pablo kills one of the guys, and then ultimately Kelly's like, "Oh, well, hey, like, yeah, just put on the costume and just like put on the camouflage, and ultimately you'll blend in." But eventually, this deadite like person comes, this person comes back to life as a deadite, and so like reasonably, the guy is just like kicking him to death, and so eventually it just gets to the mood point where ultimately they just kind of go and eventually just kind of kill everybody. And so like really this part really here is a boatload of filler, to be brutally honest. This part here is just to like, hey, we don't have any story, so how about we just make this part up as a filler to just get us to the rest of the show, to where we get to the real important part, uh which is the Evil Dead-ish like closure that we needed and deserved. So going into this, the Ash and all of his group beat up the hillbilly Ash like people, and so they are walking back to their cars, and Ash stops. He's like, "You know what? I just want to tell you guys, like this big winded speech of like, yeah, I'm really proud of all of you, and like, and the moments that we've had together, I will cherish for the rest of my life, and and this and that." He goes through this big winded speech, and the group is just like, "Oh wow, that's really nice of you to say," and but they're like, "Yeah, but it's really oddly placed," and so they're walking to the car, and then eventually they get to the car, and they're waiting for Ash with the keys. Of course, he's going to drive. So they're looking back at the car. They're looking back. They're looking at the car, and then they're looking at Ash, and they're like, Ash is gone. They're looking for Ash, and he's gone. So Pablo realizes that Ash had told him before the entire journey of this is to go back to the cabin that he had ultimately survived, to fight this thing that he's going up against one last time. And ultimately, that's where he figures that Ash has been heading to this entire time. So it ends up that Pablo and Kelly are going their way, and Amanda is making her own way to find Ash, to where this cabin is. And so Pablo and Kelly end up making their path, and they go and meet these hikers. Immediately, these hikers are just like, hey, yeah, they're trying to tell Kelly and Pablo their life story, and this and that, like as if these people, we have to figure out how to invest in these characters. So this is, we're trying to, as much as possible, giving these hikers as much backstory as possible in a short amount of time. So ultimately, Pablo and Kelly are asking, like, hey, like, have you guys seen a cabin around here? And ultimately, the one guy is ultimately saying, well, yeah, I think we saw a cabin back east. And Kelly and Pablo are mentioning, well, hey, like, yeah, we are really crappy with directions. Could you happen to just kind of showcase us where this cabin is? So they all go together to ultimately head to this cabin. And so ultimately, the entire time, one of the blonde girls that is, of course, with these hikers, immediately latching herself onto Pablo, asking through Kelly whether Pablo has a girlfriend, and Kelly says that he does. Ultimately, when the blonde hiker confirms this to Pablo, he's like, yeah, no, I don't, like, I have one, but it's not really serious. And ultimately, it seems like the blonde girl is really like grabbing Pablo's hand and trying to be like comforted with Pablo, and like getting really close to making Kelly really uncomfortable. So Ash is at the cabin, basically telling the cabin, it's like, hey, like, I fought you once before, and I've come back here once again to take you down. And so immediately, once he has this speech of his that he's like, I'm gonna fight my fears and take you down once again. Amanda, the detective, ends up like dropping her way to say, hey, Ash, why did you leave us? Ash tells her that's like, well, hey, like, if I would have came with you guys to this cabin, it would have left in your bloody and your desolate deaths. So ultimately, I decided to face this alone to spare you the pain and torture and heartache of death, and this and that, all this rigmarole. And so the detective Amanda is just to finally like, well, hey, we're gonna come here together and we're gonna face this, and I like we're gonna go through this regardless. So Ash is like, okay. So they go in there together, and so recently, immediately, there's a deer that is a deer head that is mounted onto the wall that falls over, and all of a sudden, immediately, Amanda is getting a reflection of her partner dying via being pierced by deer antler mounted on wall. And so Ash is looking at her, and he's like, you okay? Like, hey, you wanted to come in here. And she's like, no, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And so immediately the plan of attack, because this is the Evil Dead movie house or movie cabin. And so the very first plan of attack is to do exactly what they did in the Evil Dead movie, which is immediately to go down to the cellar, the underground thing, and they have to open the cellar-esh like door that had numerous times been caged shut or chained shut, to go down there because they really needed to, but that never really, for a bulk of the point, is a big thing. So, anyways, in the show. So, anyways, we go into here, and Ash says, "Well, it seems like this door is locked. So now I need to go and get tools to break open this door to get down here." And ultimately, he is saying, "Well, there's a shed nearby that has some tools." And Amanda is like, well, should I go with you? Like, and ultimately, Ash is saying, well, hey, like, just to let you know, in this shed, I have the head of my girlfriend in this shed. like if anything, her dead body is also in there, and but if anything, like one good thing is she really had a really rockin' bod. So Amanda's just like, you know what, I just don't want to deal with that right now. How about I just stay here and you go to the shed? And he's like, all right. So he goes in the shed and he looks at the skull of his girlfriend, and immediately he is uh, just feeling guilty because he's like, yeah, I'm sorry, baby, that we never went to Jacksonville, and that it's like I still love you, and blah 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 blah. So while Ash is getting all the tools for all the stuff that he needs to break into the place that he needs to break in, all of a sudden the shed closes and he can't get out of the shed. And then eventually the skull is now a actually person's head that is just starting to just start chatty, being all bratty, and being Ash's dead girlfriend. That is ultimately very much complaining to him that ultimately it's like, hey, you left me here and we were never able to go to Jacksonville, and like I know you've been sleeping with numerous women and throwing yourself at them, and like every single way to Sunday to make him feel guilty and to make him feel bad about her being there, and to the point to where Ash is telling her to shut up. And he ultimately gets out of the shed and proceeds back into the cabin. So ultimately, Amanda is just having an amazing time at this cabin, to the point to where ultimately she is just kind of reflecting on some things, and ultimately Ash comes back and ultimately tells her, hey, you know what? Like, I don't know, there's something between us. There's some kind of like weird chemistry here, and like Amanda and Detective Amanda is just like, well, hey, like, you know what, I could probably do better, but and he's like, yeah, but you know what? I've realized when coming here that I think I faced my fears. Like, you know what? I think I think that we're good. I think we're fine. You know what? I think it's about time for us to just kind of, run away together. How about we do that? You and me just go on the road and just run away together. And he puts his hand on her shoulder, and Detective Amanda looks at his hand and she's like, ugh. It's like his hand is all mangled and maggoty and ugly looking, because ultimately what happens is that hand that um, Ruby had found, the closer and closer it gets to Ash, the hand had started to just uh, uncle it itself, or what it had it itself, like Adam families like, and just flipped over and started to crawl away on its own accord. And so this hand had grown a whole entire Ash to fight Ash, and that is his master plan. So, when revealing all this, Detective Amanda is just like, "Oh my god, you're not my Ash." And he's like, "Well, yeah, but I can be." And she's like, "No, no, there's no way this is going to work." And so it basically gets to the point to where evil Ash is just going to just go, "Okay, well, since this is not going to work, then I am just going to end up just having to kill you." And so Amanda tries to kill, evil Ash tries to kill Detective Amanda in the way that her partner had died, uh, breaking her limbs and ultimately trying as much as possible to give her the most pain that she can have, to the point of telling her, hey, the pain that you're in right now is the exact same amount of pain that your partner was in when he died. So, like, I guess you can feel as good as that as of being even with your partner now. So Ash ends up coming back into the cabin, and ultimately he is like, "Oh my God, what happened, Amanda?" And Amanda's like, "You're right." It's like, and so Ash tries to comfort her as much as humanly possible, but eventually Amanda just dies, which is sad. I know, but she'll maybe come back one day. So Ash Ash ends up finding the Necronomicon, and the Necronomicon is so much more chatty than it ever has been. And so the Necronomicon is talking away to him and ultimately talking all this crap. And so ultimately, eventually, it ends up finding out, or Ash ends up finding out uh, that his evil twin is here again to fight him. So this is kind of very much like Evil Dead 2, or maybe almost quasi like Army of Darkness in some ways, where eventually Ash is ending up having to fight himself. And so basically, Ash ends up fighting himself. He ends up winning, of course, and basically ending his own cloned evil cloned like life. So it ends up that Pablo and Kelly separate themselves from the hikers once finding out where this cabin was, and so they're like, well, hey, yeah, like the hikers are just like, well, hey, like later days, and they start to leave. And so Pablo and Kelly knock on the door, and they ultimately get to find uh, the dead body of Amanda, but then also the dead body of Ash with other evil Ash. And so basically, um, Ash is saying, "Well, hey, I'm gonna have to start like chopping up these bodies because ultimately you don't want them to come back to haunt us. So like I'm gonna start chopping up these bodies and this and that." All the while we find out that these hikers, like the weather is getting really bad and really poor, so they knock on the door, and so ultimately Ash is like, who the heck are those people? And Pablo and Kelly explain who they are, and so ultimately he's like, well, hey, get rid of them. Like, ultimately we don't want them to come in here because they are going to die. Like, try to figure out a way to get rid of them. Like, Elk River is down the road, so ultimately get them onto the river and get them out of here. Like, don't have them come in here. Do whatever you can to not get them in here. So Pablo and Kelly go out there and tell them that, hey, yeah, we can't have you come to this cabin because they are chopping up uh, dead uh, dead animal carcasses, and you don't want that kind of smell and this and that. So Kelly and Pablo are pushing them out to the river, and ultimately it seems like the blonde of the three are ultimately like telling Pablo and Kelly, it's like, you know what, you guys are kind of shady, and it doesn't really seem like you're really telling us the truth. It doesn't really seem like you guys are chopping up dead animal carcasses in there. What's really going on? Because ultimately, when the blonde girl is confronting Pablo about him having a girlfriend, he's like, well, yeah, just like I don't know if it's really like really true what exactly she told you. It just seems like the hikers are realizing that a lot of stuff that they're saying doesn't really seem to consistently make sense or connect or doesn't sound true. So ultimately, the hikers are now asking for them to be really and truly honest about them. And so Ash is chopping up his own evil twin Ash-like body, and he's mentioning that, like, you know what? There's ever a time where I'm chopping up my own body, uh, like, man, like, that would be one day where I'd live in just, like, ignorant bliss, just not having to deal with me chopping up my own body at some point. Uh, so Ash just starts chopping away to realize that Amanda is gone. Ultimately, while the hikers are away, just enjoying their journey, coming up to having Pablo and Kelly tell the hikers the truth, ultimately there is a fist that goes through one of the hikers' bodies. One of fist through person's chest. And so immediately the male hiker freaks out and he's like, "Oh my god!" Like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna," like, she tries to console this girl, but then eventually right away we find out that Detective Amanda had turned into a deadite. And so now she kills the male hiker, and basically she turns both the female hiker and the male hiker into these puppets to basically ridicule and humiliate Kelly and Pablo because they do whatever Ash tells them to do, and ultimately, like, she's bickering about their unsured love relationship and this and that, and so ultimately that neither one of them are having a backbone or whatever, and this and that. So we have it to where the blonde hiker is just like, "Oh my god, like, my friends are dead." And so reasonably it ends up that Pablo and Kelly decide to go, okay, well, we need to kill Amanda. So they start shooting away. They start firing all their bullets at her. The only problem is that Amanda shields herself with the two hiker bodies. So basically, these hiker bodies are getting litanied with bullets. And then they reload, fire again, and, like, again, still moot point. Detective Amanda isn't going to get killed because ultimately, when looking at it, it's just to the point to where, yeah, she's shielded by other people. So ultimately, they end up just kind of running off back into the cabin. And so reasonably, what happens is of course, blonde hiker is the only one that's really left that doesn't know any better, and basically, she gets kind of told the truth, and recently is told, like, "Hey, this cabin is haunted, and it's gonna, like, kill you, so, like, watch out." So eventually, this blonde hiker eventually starts to notice that there's bugs coming from out of her pants, and ultimately they start, like, crawling all over her body, and she freaks out. Then eventually, while Pablo and Kelly are away, um, to ultimately fight out uh, Detective Amanda at some point, the house just starts chewing up and spitting out this blonde girl. Starts putting, like, screws into her head and all kinds of sorts of craziness. Uh, to where, wait a minute, to where I think Kelly might be out taking out Detective Amanda, and then the blonde girl uh, is getting chewed up and spit out. And here's what also happens: we find out that Ash is talking to Ruby, and Ruby is convincing him that, hey, how about since I am here to help you, how about I take this burden off of you? How about you give me the burden of this book, and so that way you can just trade this burden off of yourself and then just be scot-free to ultimately go to Jacksonville. And Bruce is just like, well, you know what? That sounds really appealing. How about I do that? So uh, Ruby is reading the book to try to ultimately say that convincingly uh, Ash's burden is gone, but Ruby just keeps reading off of this book. To eventually the book cover ends up coming off, to eventually be placed onto Pablo, that ends up turning into being possessed by the Necronomicon, and all of a sudden he's spewing out all of this blood, and then eventually, because ultimately Ash makes it down to the cellar and is with Pablo and is with Ruby, and so eventually Kelly makes it down there as well, because ultimately Blonde Hiker is mincemeat for this house. So while this is all going on, Pablo and Ash are fighting it out, and reasonably, like, it's half book, half Pablo, and so reasonably Ash does not want to kill Pablo because reasonably it's his best friend. So immediately Pablo is telling Ash to kill him with using the chainsaw, but the chainsaw loses gas, and Ash says, "Oh, you miserable idiot! Like you didn't tell me to put gas back in the chainsaw, so I can't kill you. Ha ha ha! Sucks to be you. Now we have to figure out some way to get this demon out of you." And again, like, there's something about the way this season kind of ends. It just kind of feels a little bit of lackluster at some point, but it is what it is. But I guess they had to kind of do some things and approach some stuff and this and that. So what happens is that Pablo and Ash can't fight one another. And so what ends up happening is Pablo ends up spewing out some, like, fly looking like baby. Like I say, fly like baby. If you've ever seen the end of the movie The Fly, it doesn't really quite look like a baby at first, but that's basically what it becomes. And so Ash is like, "Ew, it's a good thing I never had children." So this thing ends up forming this little demon, and that Pablo had spewed out. And so Ash is like, "You know what? I'm gonna count to the count of 3, and then I'm gonna take you down, little demon." So he starts counting down to 3. He's like, 1, 2, 2.5. You know what? I'm gonna take you down, kid. Like, hey, like, you gotta get back to where you came. And so the little demon and Ash are fighting it out, and so eventually he ends up killing said demon because Ash just kills everything. And so it ends up that Ash is talking to Ruby and, like, saying, "Hey, what you're doing, like, is not helping." Like, what you're doing is not really helping. So, like, I'm going to take you down, Ruby, because, like, you're doing the wrong thing. So ultimately, Ash and Ruby start to fight. Ash pops some shotgun shells into Ruby, which does nothing because Ruby just heals herself. But since Ash is the only threat to Ruby, Ruby makes a deal with him. Ultimately tells him, "Hey, I will make a treaty with you, a truce with you. How about this? How about you give me the Necronomicon, the book, and I do whatever I want with it, and I send you to Jacksonville, and you can live the rest of your life happy and free and whatever. And so Ash is just like, well, you know what? That deal sounds really great, but I want to be able to go to Jacksonville with my friends, with Pablo and Kelly. So you got to make that happen. And Ruby is like, done. Changing book covered Pablo to regular Pablo, because ultimately, while Ruby and Ash were fighting, uh, Ruby needed a new book cover, and so she was starting to slice open Ash's face to have his face be the new book cover, but but Ash shot her with shotgun shells, so ultimately, um, like yeah, it was just like they were stalemated. So that's when she made this bargain. And ultimately, Ash immediately asks right after that, well, hey, now that my friends are okay, now I want $10,000. And Ruby's just like, dude, do I look like a bank to you? And Ash says, well, okay, I want, uh, I want, um, money for the trip to make it to Jacksonville. And Ruby is like, done. So we ultimately have it to where Pablo and Kelly were the entire time Ash is making this deal, they were telling him that this is wrong and that this isn't like you gotta fight her, you gotta fight the evil and this and that. And so immediately while on this car ride that ultimately Ash is just so excited to finally make it to Jacksonville and live happily ever after, Pablo and Kelly are still just like, well, hey, this doesn't make any sense. We gotta go back. We gotta get this book. We gotta solve everything. And Ash is like, you know what? I've solved everything. Like I'm having my happy ending, and this deal is done. Time to go to Jacksonville and live my happy ever after, and this and that. And like he won't hear it otherwise. He's turning on some music and enjoying the ride to Jacksonville. So uh, Ash and Kelly and Pablo drive off, and as we realize, the ground is crumbling and falling right behind them as the road of which they drive away from is slowly but surely crumbling around them. So, what I'm assuming is going to happen within this journey is that here's my thought. I ultimately haven't seen season 2 yet. Eventually, I will get there. But what I think happens is that the entire time I think that this is a Justice League episode that is dubbed "The Man Who Has Everything," where Ash is ultimately going to go to Jacksonville, thinking that he's going to be living his best life in Jacksonville, and that this is the happily ever after that he's ever wanted. And while he's going to be in Jacksonville, he's going to start to realize that Jacksonville is crumbling all around him because ultimately he needed, like, he can't have Jacksonville without also beating evil, because if he goes to Jacksonville, if he goes to Jacksonville, and doesn't beat evil, then evil will just completely annihilate the whole entire planet and make it to where Jacksonville no longer exists. So I think it's like basically like the Superman story, The Man Who Has Everything, where ultimately uh, Ash has to defeat evil in order to get his happy ending, because he can't just bargain with it, because eventually Jacksonville will no longer exist, or ultimately he will just give up Jacksonville to go and refight back evil, because that is his journey. So I'm going to get out of here because ultimately you might be hearing a in the background, which is normally my neighbors carpentering away because that's what they do with their lives. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.